Hello, I'm Beth the Builder, and this week's Honest Guide to Home Repair is paint! All paint is made up of solvents, resins, additives, and pigments. I think it's important to know that because the differences in those things is what makes different paints different. Okay, so this is something that I've recently been doing some research on, and that's interior versus exterior paint. So I recently did a thing where I bought exterior paint because it was on sale, and I was like, why the not? And me and my mom had a whole discussion about well, why can't you just use exterior paint inside? And we were like, well, there's nothing stopping us, so we're gonna do it. And then I did some researching about what the actual difference is between those two kinds of paint. Okay, so the biggest difference between exterior and interior paint are additives and resins. Okay, so exterior paint contains additives that help it hold up against elements. So temperature, UV rays, mildew, mold, various things. I think temperature being the number one thing, because that's the thing outside that is really going to fluctuate way more than the interior of your home. Exterior paint has flexible resin in it, so it can expand and contract along with the material, rather than interior paint has rigid resin. So that's the main difference between exterior and interior paint. So exterior paint has higher VOCs, which are volatile organic compounds. And as the paint dries, these are released into the air, and they're the reason why you might get dizzy or feel kind of sick or something if you're using a paint that has high VOCs. And you can also get paint with no VOCs, but I don't trust that shit. But this is potentially the main reason why you may not want to use exterior paint inside, because it's going to release these chemicals into the air for up to 6 months potentially as the paint is drying and curing and everything. So I've used exterior paint in my home and I've never noticed any difference, at all. I've never felt sick, I've never felt nauseous. So I think it's kind of up to your discretion. The main thing is exterior paint is formulated specifically for outside. So I don't think it's really something that you need to do vice versa, use exterior paint inside and inside outside. I don't know why you would need to do that, but sometimes that's all the shit you have and you just gotta use what you gotta use. I also think something is interesting is that interior paint is actually formulated to stand up against scrubbing and scuffs and dings and stuff like that better than exterior paint, which I think is really interesting because you might think the opposite. Exterior paint is actually more likely to scratch and ding. You might think because exterior paint is formulated to be out in the elements that it's going to be better, but that's not necessarily true. Alright, and the end of my exterior paint story is I thought, what if I have exterior paint and I have interior paint and I want to mix them? Why can't I do that? So the answer I found was, yeah, you can do that. The two things to be aware of is it water-based? You can mix water-based and water-based, but you can't mix water-based and oil-based, because come on people, basic science. Oil and water don't mix. And the second note was it's better to mix two things that are close to the same finish. So an eggshell and a flat, or a semi-gloss and a gloss, versus mixing semi-gloss and eggshell. That seems like a bad idea. So I think that makes sense. They're gonna have an uneven tone when they dry because one is supposed to be shiny and one's supposed to be flat. So that kind of makes sense, but also a good word of the wise. So what's the difference between oil-based and water-based? I think it's fairly self-explanatory, just in the names there. But I think some things to be aware of is obviously water-based always has that really, really big pro of cleanup, that you can just throw it in a sink and scrub it off with some soap and water. So oil-based obviously has the huge detractor of you need paint thinner or something to clean up oil-based paint. But it also is shinier, it's more durable overall, but oil-based has those high VOCs that no one likes, and it is also much slower to dry than water-based. So oil-based is very rigid in its resins, and it can't flex as much with the material as water-based can. But water-based also is actually more resistant to UV rays, and it actually retains its sheen a lot longer than oil-based. It's kind of a pros and cons game here with all these things. So I think oil-based paint still has its place in doing a project with it, but I think a lot of the times water-based paint is just gonna win out because it's just easier to use. I've never bought oil-based paint, and I may not ever. It used to be everything was oil-based and that was the only option, so that's what you used. I mean, it was full of lead and it was probably not great, but you know, that's what we had. And now there are just so many more options that you have to figure out like what is the best choice for your project and for your house. So something that's important to know when you're painting is it water-based or oil-based on that wall? Because you can put oil-based on top of water-based latex paint, but you can't do it the other way around. You're gonna have to prime or do something extra. So the way that you figure out which kind of paint's on your wall is you put some goof off on that paint, or Goo Gone, or whatever the heck you call it, and then you try and scrape the paint off, and if the paint comes off with the goof off, latex, water-based. If it does not, it's oil-based. So I think a myth that I at least felt like I was taught about paint is primer. So when do you need to prime? When do you not need to prime? To prime or not to prime? I feel like there's a joke in here somewhere, but whatever. So I feel like I was always told that you need to prime like every single surface every time you paint, even if it's already been painted, which I kind of felt like didn't make sense, but that's what I was told. And now, as I've gotten older, I'm like, F that, I'm gonna paint whatever the I want, and if I'm wrong, I mean, then I know. And I've done some researching about this as well, and what I've found is some simple guidelines, I guess. So, when to prime? We'll make a list. If you're applying a lower finish than is on the wall. So if you're going from semi-gloss to flat, prime, supposedly. I don't know, I read that somewhere, but I've never done that. I just paint it. Okay, 2. If you're doing a lot of spackling or puttying or using a lot of drywall compound to like fill holes and shit, prime those areas and then paint them. 3, this is the biggest one that makes sense to me. Unfinished surfaces, so drywall, unfinished wood, etc. Prime. 4, we just talked about this, going from oil-based to water-based latex paint. Prime. You can put oil on latex, but you can't put latex on oil without priming. There's fancy primers out there that are specifically for this thing, so that you don't have to like scrape all the fucking oil-based paint off, because that's not gonna happen. You're not gonna do that. No one is going to do that. But then if you're going from latex paint, water-based paint on your wall, to oil-based, you can just do that. Oil-based will like adhere to whatever the it wants. 5, if the thing you're painting is rusty or greasy or moldy, mildewy, etc., get a better primer, prime that thing. So like Kills is the thing I've used. It's very, very handy. It works really well. Do that because it does work, and then those greasy, rusty, gross stains behind won't show through to your paint, supposedly. I'm imagining it depends on how disgusting that thing is. 6, if you're painting something that's weird, like ceramic or metal or plastic, there's special paints obviously for that, but I think probably priming that thing before is going to get the paint to adhere better. 7, this is the one that I've actually just recently learned about, which I thought was a really good idea. So if you're having to prime and you're painting a very dark color, rather than getting a primer that's like white or gray or whatever, is you get that primer and you tint it to the same color as the paint color you're gonna paint. So then your wall is already prepped to the color that you're going to paint. And obviously if you're painting a really light color, it's not that big of a deal. But if you're doing a really dark color, it's annoying to have to paint so many layers and then you're trying to cover up the primer. So this is something I've just learned about, that they're like, you can get tintable primer, tint the primer to your color. And I was like, that's fucking brilliant. That's such a good idea. So that is my final and best tip about primer, is tint your primer if you're doing a dark color. Otherwise, don't, it doesn't fucking matter. So those are my 7 tips about primer. All right, so leave me a comment about some dumb, weird painting advice that you've gotten that was stupid. Like, dislike if you think I'm full of shit and I don't know what I'm talking about. That's okay too. Subscribe if you want more honest home repair videos every Friday, and thanks for watching.